And thanks everyone for organising this. Yeah, Jack and everyone from UAL. I think so. Laura and I haven't prepared presentations in the same way. I think we were going to have more of a kind of conversation, which maybe makes it less well structured, but maybe interesting in a different way, perhaps. I don't know, Laura. Do you agree? I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the previous conversation was so rich, and it does draw out a lot of, I think, concepts and ideas that we've been experimenting with in our own research practices. So I think we'll try to make some connections with the previous discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was really, obviously it's really interesting, right? And I talk a lot about metaphors and what metaphors people use for AI and what metaphors people use to understand these systems. But the what we just heard from Maya and Rushan was actually doing that properly, like investigating that in a proper way, rather than just saying, how do you think it works? Pick a thing. That kind of level of detailed investigation, I think, is really so useful for designers, anyone thinking about, what does user experience mean when the systems what's behind the scenes of the systems you're experiencing changes, learns, maybe serving agendas you don't know, maybe is not what you think it is, maybe is represented in a different way, maybe is all of those kind of questions, and the extent to which designers should represent that, or the extent to which they can avoid it at all. It's really fascinating, right? I can see that it's going to be it's already a big issue, but I think it's going to be even more of an issue in service design, user experience in general. I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say, Dan, and you've introduced the new metaphors kind of Twitter feed, and I think it's actually really brilliant, because I think designers are involved in creating those kinds of new metaphors, both from experiments and projects that we do in design studios. But yeah, exactly. And so one thing I wanted to contribute, though, is this idea that as experiences are being captured, essentially, one aspect of some of the previous conversation, I think, is the ways in which the amount of data that needs to be collected to make, for example, AR and VR systems work, or metaverse type systems that are, being hyped quite a bit right now. It's basically saying, like, let's try to capture more and more data about an even wider range of human experiences, right? And in particular, the concept of surveillance capitalism comes up, of, is this just exchanging more and more privacy for profit, but who's benefiting from that, of course. So some of the political questions around that. And so really just asking, I have written in my own research about my own experiencing using this smart insulin pump device. And one of the experiences that data set is collecting is really on sleep patterns, let's say, for example, like what your blood sugar data is in the middle of the night is being captured. And where that concept of the map meeting the territory comes up is in the ways in which these systems fail, and the ways in which failure is distributed across human and machine, I think, as was touched on. So those are some of the things that interested me in terms of how can designers, in understanding some of these systems and how they work, try to reimagine them through new metaphors that are not as oppressive as, for example, the exchange of data for experience.
That's interesting. Yeah. I wonder whether the kind of, I don't know, even the idea that something should be exchanged, that in some way, you're providing this data in order to, if you want the product to work well, or if you want a good experience, you're going to have to give us your data. There's this idea that it's sort of that exchange model, that nothing can come for free. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There's all of this is encoded in that in a way that I think is, first of all, isn't probably necessary, but also that we've become so quickly accustomed to it. Oh, of course I'm going to get these adverts for stuff that, of course they're going to be listening to me, or of course it's going to track me, because You know, how else could the world possibly work if it wasn't just about exploiting each other? Of course, we're going to space in order to mine Mars for whatever minerals it is, because that's it, right? Extraction is the only thing. And I know people, I'm thinking of like particularly writing around like when big data was a thing, right? I think Sarah Watson wrote about the kind of big data as oil metaphor, like what the implications were, which was it's something to be extracted, it's something to be processed, it's something where there are new territories to explore, to exploit, and to kind of search for. What if we could extract this data too, and what if and I think that's quite, I don't know, I mean, it's sort of obvious, but on the other hand, if we don't question them, or if we're not able to step outside those framings, and I think we just by default fall into particular ways of doing things, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things we might raise up is this idea that we're still very much thinking in terms of binaries in the design studio. I don't think yet we have, while there's a great potential to, think in terms of new metaphors, the terminologies that we take as a colloquial language for our design work is still very much on sort of binary opposition. We haven't yet created that hybrid design language that might allow us to navigate some of these things in a little bit more of a nuanced way. So one of the terms that I would bring up is this idea of digital materiality, especially because of the theme of this symposium. Scholars, Masmedium and Durish have this concept of digital materiality. And by that, they mean both the things in the physical world that are sort of digital, and that might include something like autonomous vehicles or my smart insulin pump, but also the fact that the things that are happening within the systems are also material. So that means that this idea of dematerialization, which I think is a theme for the symposium, might be somewhat rethought a bit, right? So this idea that I know that with the iPhone, one of the design agendas was to make the interface kind of disappear. And so year after year, we've seen, instead of having a little frame around the iPhone, that is essentially just a glass rectangle now, right? So the interface has somewhat disappeared so that it would blend into the world. And that was a deliberate design decision. But that then dismisses or absolves responsibility for the things that are really material. Like, for example, mining, the different minerals that are needed, right, in order to make all of these technologies. So environmental consequences are one aspect that are highly material, no matter what the system we're talking about, whether it's a representation, something that's happening in zeros and ones on a circuit board, right? And so that's, I think, one language that is a hybrid language that creates a new way of navigating some of these questions around dematerialization and experience.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It also makes me think of the sort of debate around, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, kind of seamlessness was the goal of so many of these things. We need a seamless everything. The Internet of Things needs to be seamless. Technologies need to be seamless. Like, we shouldn't know whether or not the device is switching from one network to another, or whether or not the different components of it are from different manufacturers or whatever. Or with software, we shouldn't know. It should all be seamless. But I always thought that was, and obviously there was then a reaction. People said, well, no, actually, seamfulness tells us something more, right? It's important to see the joins between systems. It's important to see where the edge of that screen is, rather than it just blending into it, because the edge of that screen actually has a lot of information about the difference between those two worlds, or the difference between. But it was one of those things, and this is probably just my kind of not really thinking this through in quite the right way, but it's a sort of similar argument when like people talk about kind of transparency. I want this system to be transparent. It should be transparent. And I think transparent can mean two different things, right? It can mean we make the metaphorical casing of the system, whatever it is, see-through, so we can see what's inside it, right? So if you did that with, I don't know, the algorithm that is calculating health insurance premiums, for people in, somewhere, if you made the smooth casing, if you like, the seamless way that's presented to someone transparent, you would see the biases that are inherent within the system, because it would be making the casing transparent. But I feel like transparency was also often used by a lot of people in UX and in kind of interaction design to mean the user cannot see the system at all. So your idea of the iPhone not having a boundary, or it just being kind of completely merging with the world, that's making the internal components transparent as well. I mean, not literally, but saying, well, we don't want you to see them either. We want you to see through it. We don't even want you to see the technology at all. And I've never quite resolved, like, to me, the word is used to mean two, like the metaphor of transparency is used to mean two almost opposite things, depending on how it's being used. But both of them are said to be very positive, of course, because, it's all about transparency. And maybe that's just my ignorance, but it's like, I think there's something there that tells us something about how we think about black boxes, or, there's a paper by Ranulph Glanville from, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 years ago, where he's arguing, following sort of 1950s cybernetics, like Ross Ashby, he's arguing that inside there's this idea of like a white box, which is a black box that's explained effectively once you know what's in the black box. But Ranulph Glanville was arguing that, like, inside every white box, there's just two or more black boxes, right? Because until you actually, all black boxes is a good thing in the sense that it's the only way we can make sense of the world. It's like the map not being the territory. We need some degree of abstraction, otherwise we have to pay attention to everything continuously all the time, and it would be a one-to-one scale map that is not actually usable. So and maybe again, this is obvious to a lot of designers, but it's like the level of abstraction that you do, or what you choose to abstract. What do you choose to make a metaphor or not? What level of what do you choose to hide or simplify? What do you choose to explain in more detail? These sort of decisions, I think, designers have always had to make them, but when almost everything that people are working on there's no right answer, right? It's all abstractions. It can only be explained through metaphors. Even, machine learning, even that kind of one of the diagrams that Maya showed with the landscape and all of that, like it can only really be explained through metaphors. So it's all kind of up for grabs, which is, I don't know what we do with that, but it's something.
I mean, one of my interests has been definitely on sort of these concepts like seamlessness or transparency and these multiple meanings, as you say, is how can we essentially make more use of the theoretical concepts that exist out there in secondary literature based on long-term studies of technologies or of human culture, right? And essentially make concepts that have a more specific meaning, not something that can mean sort of two completely different things, but concepts that have very particular meaning have more value in the design studio as kind of principles that might drive the design. And I'm just curious on if you've seen anything, what are sort of the latest concepts that are being used, like if certain concepts have become, let's say, passé or not as, or kind of understood to be simplistic, like seamlessness, for example, then what are the latest, and are we able to kind of start moving away from like a colloquial language and towards a more specific set of meanings to bring into the design studio?
It's a good question, Laura. I mean, I think probably, the futures are here. They're just not evenly distributed, right? I mean, pasts are still here and they're not evenly distributed either. I mean, I don't know. I see a lot of, so our students at TU Eindhoven, a lot of the students are very interested in concepts of post-human design, of, and they read, I mean, particularly one of your articles has been very useful to many of them. But I'm not sure they really know what to do with it at present. I think it's a concept that feels very powerful because it feels like it's moving beyond the human-centered design kind of paradigm. It's moving towards something that includes not just nature potentially, but also future generations as well. And even, I don't know, we had a talk a couple of weeks ago from a PhD researcher who was considering objects with intent as, so potentially AI or things that have some sort of agenda. Well, why are they not part of a post-human design methodology? Because they're going to be entities in the world that are doing things, which of course is true, but it's not often thought of in that way, or it doesn't seem to be. So Um, yeah, I think that's probably quite a useful concept but then does it just become overhyped? I mean, I think like lots of things, it's designers, part of maybe what a lot of designers enjoy, this sort of bricolage of concepts from here and there, is that you can kind of use them as inspiration, even if you don't actually follow what they mean. I mean, I've seen a lot of things described as boundary objects. We want to create a boundary object, and I guess they probably actually all are boundary objects in some way, but it's more the idea of having a label which inspires doing something, I think is a big part of design, right? But that doesn't necessarily work very well when you try and do a critical kind of analysis of, well, in what way is this actually post-human, or in what way is this actually pluriversal, or like as John's added in the chat. I mean, I think the pluriverse idea, like and particularly Arturo Escobar's book has inspired a lot of design students currently, but I'm not sure whether they're able within the systems that we're in to actually enact something that really represents that, because it's very different. It's very difficult to do things that embody a truly sort of pluriversal approach if you have to do something that implies you've got to have a finished project at the end of the semester, and it has to be presented in this way, and you've got to get your job at this company. And I think that we're trapped in a model that perhaps doesn't actually fit some of these maybe more radical approaches. But
yes, that might be a good time to kind of turn to a discussion of the ways in which we try to materialize knowledge and experiences, and thinking in particular, Dan, of your work and the workshop that we did together, also with several others, this idea that I think that we can, move beyond our explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge, and sort of tapping into latent knowledge, as Liz Sanders would say, through kind of some kind of hands-on engagement in building, making things together as a way of navigating the knowledge.
Yeah, I think there's something. I mean, I'm fascinated, and I've just never really got over this idea that so much of what design is about, and I guess art and music and literature, and maybe most forms of some sort of endeavor, is basically about people trying to share what's in their head with other people. And obviously you can never actually achieve that, right? But the idea that in some way making something together is a form of like a physical thing, or it could be a digital thing, it could be something else. That basic idea that this is about trying to materialize your imagined state of the world, or your imagined something you can't actually necessarily express. Like if someone, I mean, I guess this is something that I'm very fascinated by. It's just this, like, how do we express things that have no actual obvious form? Like, if you do say, well, what does, okay, so that with the AI, the stereotype of, well, what does AI look like? It's a picture of a brain, or Android type dummy with blue LEDs and the printed circuit board for a brain, or whatever, like that thing. And I know there's this Better Images of AI project, which has recently started to try to replace those with much more interesting, much more realistic, much more better images, similar project about climate change as well, like Climate Visuals, that tries to find actual images of this is the effect it's having. This is not a picture of a polar bear on an iceberg, or a sort of anyway, I'm rambling, but I think basically the value of trying to materialize how we think about abstract things, the relationships between them, but not just materialize as in making a model, but actually using materials themselves and the properties of them as a way of encoding or capturing some of that meaning. And I know, from the workshop that Laura, you mentioned that we did with John as well, and Lisa Brawley and a number of other people, Manuela Aguera Loa and Palak Dudani, and quite a number of others, where we were trying to use, at least part of it, trying to use the properties of materials themselves as a way that people could express relationships. So if two ideas seem to be repelling each other, then perhaps, magnets that are opposed are a way of sharing that knowledge with others, or sharing that feeling, that experience, that to me these two ideas can't be brought together. They're too separate. So perhaps you make something that actually can't be brought together, or perhaps they're connected by something that pulls them, that something that does pull them together. They're kind of elastic kind of idea. So I think, and there are people, I mean, most recently, like for example, like Marion Lean, her PhD at the RCA on kind of more like data materialization, which is taking these sort of ideas around like physicalizing data, but actually really paying attention to the materials that are used. So that it's not just, 3D printed bar charts, but is much more about, what does it mean to make it out of textiles? What does it mean to make it out of a particular textile that has a particular texture or a particular feel or particular color? And I think these kind of approaches make more use of the skills that designers have, the kind of abilities to materialize experience, I guess, in some form. But
yeah.
I mean, Laura, how do you, because with this sort of idea, I mean, you have a strong theoretical set of perspectives, I think, right? Much more than I do. How do these fields of kind of critical approaches and STS and all these, how do they approach this? And have they, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there's been a great interest in the social sciences in general, as well as STS specifically, in making and doing, so to speak. So finding ways to do projects that are, whether the project is a podcast or a data visualization or a prototype of some kind or an event or performance, that has grown greatly in the last 10 years. So there's definitely a lot of interest in doing that. And, I think that then, because different fields are sort of stronger on different elements, some of the projects are really amazing, but then not everyone has all of the same ability to make things as we do in the design field. So that's, where I think a really fruitful coming together of some of those fields, would be really productive. I think, one of the things my students have been doing in the sort of Designing Futures course is really trying to materialize more of the senses, I would say. So our recent kind of version 2 of the final project from last week, we had students bringing in like things that you could smell, like so sensory, like incense and things as part of the experience, really trying to figure out what it takes to change the mood of a classroom into some really very different kind of environment, and just using sometimes very low fidelity prototypes that are sort of meant to be things in this alternative world has been one way. So really exploiting both, touch, taste, smell, also music, and really thinking about and curating that whole set of things together. And also really trying to aim at pretty ambitious, I think, ideas about what future technologies might mean, either as a critique. So this idea of, what would happen if an AI was running for a political campaign, and then kind of creating that political campaign as a way to think about, well, is this a future that we would like? Because there's certainly lots of people, both in theoretical communities as well as in computer, computing or sort of Silicon Valley view of the world, that really do think that, both for the purpose of autonomous driving and for politics, that a computational approach would be the right one. And so, thinking through what are the questions we're trying to get at with some of those experiences that they're trying to bring to life, and really putting us in the place as participants in the kind of performance or role play of a particular future, has been one way to try to bring together, I think, critical ideas about the world together with an experiential approach.
It's interesting. There's a couple of things there that make me think. And one of them is the sensory aspects of futures are interesting, because even at a metaphorical level of like, does this smell funny, or is there a slight, does this future feel wrong even? What does that mean? The feeling, what does feel mean there, right? Is it just, am I analyzing the evidence and making a decision based on it? Well, but maybe it's more about the sense of unease that something gives you. But one thing that made me think of, so there's some work that I've been doing with Karine Lallemond and Daphne Menhera Jang-hee Lee as well from KAIST in South Korea on this idea of more kind of qualitative forms of interface, right? So how do you preserve the qualities that are in the world in the way that they're represented in some sort of interface, which may just imply something analog. It might literally just be, well, do we even need the analog to digital conversion? If you're measuring someone's pulse, does the person who wants to understand their heartbeat, do they need to know the number of beats per minute? Or is it more about, is the pattern regular or does the pattern change? And if so, it may be that there's no analog to digital conversion needed, no counting at all. It may just be that the rhythm is amplified and is then experienced in some other way, whether that's visual or whether it's, but it reminded me, one of the projects, one of Kareen's students' projects that I was reading about the other day was a running tracker that used sweat as the interface. So you had something where you saw the sweat or a representation of the sweat, effectively dribbling down a screen, because the idea was, well, why is that bad? That's an out, this is the actual index, if you like, in a semiotics kind of way. This is the output of the activity. Why would you treat that as something horrible, right? Or why would you not use an interface or create a display that used the kind of more sensory, more embodied aspects directly? And I think it could actually be quite, I think there's a lot of potential there for design that tries to, not necessarily just taking, wow, multi-sensory is cool, but actually saying, well, what is it about the phenomenon that we actually want to represent or understand? And I think there's a lot, it's a huge field, right? Because it's literally just, it could be everything, but we too often default to this kind of quantified approach that perhaps misses what the point is of the thing that we're trying to do. Like I don't want to know when I get a survey from a company saying, how likely are you to recommend this out of 10? That's not how, if I'm thinking about recommending it to someone, I'm not having a mental scale of a fictional quantification, am I? It's either I do or I don't. And the reasons are probably about the feelings that it causes, not, anyway, this stuff, but
this is really wonderful. And I think one interesting place to look for interaction designers perhaps is actually within the critical disability and disability justice community, because there's some just incredible projects like Sins Invalid, which are, include dance performances about disability, and also people who have hacked their own devices, create very different kinds of interfaces. And while the medical model of disability, looks at the person as the sort of problem, right? It's sort of like, here's the data and your data doesn't fit to the standardized norm, so there's something wrong with you. And the social model of disability says, well, the social structures are the problem. But from a, sort of crypt justice point of view, it's really about the identity of being disabled as a positive. And so then all of the art and design activities that are being done to, whether it's to think differently about your being disabled, for example, or to make some technology that assists you, but that really embodies a different set of values. And so over the last year, I've gotten involved with an artist. We've been collaborating on a sculpture, which is a robotic sculpture in which she takes the data from my smart insulin pump and prints it on the circuit board. And then the sculpture kind of moves in these really subtle ways. And it's kind of concrete and very brutalist looking sculpture. But for me, that's an interesting way to think about what has been a really frustrating experience with a designed object and turning it into this more expressive way. And I think the hard thing there is, like, how do we then evaluate, so to speak, what various kinds of qualitative or sensory approaches, what they do for us as designers or what they do in the world? And I'm not talking about necessarily evaluation as a quantitative metric, but how can we then argue for the kind of knowledge that we might be building through those research creation or those kinds of practices?
No, that is, and I think that, having to argue for things is often the crunch point with this stuff. But I don't know. I kind of think partly that, I don't know, like maybe can the thing itself not be an argument for its value? I don't want to, I can't remember who it was who said, well, what use is a baby or something, as a phrase, or what, come on, value, what value does it have? I know this is a stupid comparison, but like the idea that in itself, the thing itself might have value because of what it is, not or because of what it could do, but not in a way of having to argue that this is a particular benefit. I take your point, but maybe the object itself or the artifact can be an argument for its own existence, because it, if you find it, if it does something, if it's of interest to people, even if it's interest to one person, it's something that exists in the world that didn't before, and it offers an example of a way of doing things, right? There's there's a paper by Bill Gaver from, 10 years ago maybe, about trying to argue that research through design could actually be about just producing examples of things that could exist, and that now there's something that exists. I'm probably explaining it wrongly, but it's almost like that itself is a value. We now have something that didn't exist before, that encodes a particular thought in the world, in a thing that we can now look at. And even if it was no good, that's now a thing that wasn't previously there. So itself is a kind of contribution to knowledge just by existing.
Yeah. I think I take that point well. And I think one thing that we can do through these kinds of approaches is make things that are not solutions, making things that are questions, which is, what we try to do in these more critical, realms of design. I think for me, having been trained as a social scientist originally, is what I'm looking for is how might that thing allow me to then name new kinds of concepts that might then go back to enrich our understanding of what that experience is, or what that realm of data human interaction or whatever it is. So that's where I think, and Redstrom, argues that in making design theory, that this is an area that designers might get more involved in sort of PhD level work, and sort of aiming towards creating new concepts that can then go back to the literature and help us build a broader knowledge base as a design field.
Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense, because also, one of my long sort of, not frustrations exactly, but I think design hasn't, as an academic field, hasn't done a good job of sort of, I don't know how to word this, but like if you were working in a much more literature-based field, you might not find everything relevant that was a precedent for your work, right? And clearly, lots of people never find the stuff that actually would have, people who've said the same thing or something similar, or would have been very useful. But at least there's a system in place for trying to find it, right? And I think so much with design, like we find that there are many amazing projects that do encode that could be those bases for that theory building, but they don't go anywhere after that because there's no way of them being shared, or they're presented at a degree show and they're on a website that the university deletes the next year or whatever, no one maintains it. And there's no way of then that becoming part of a body of theory or contributing as an example, unless someone happens to remember it or find it randomly, or someone else like suggests it in the chat in a session like this and says, hang on a minute, that's what someone's whole project is about. They just called it something different. And I don't think that design doesn't seem to have been very good as an academic field at doing that kind of, like the canon. What is the canon of design projects? Mm-hmm. Like, is that a thing? Is that too the wrong way of thinking about it? Probably it is, but I don't know. I don't know what we do about that, but I think maybe in this area it could help, where we're at the boundaries of kind of trying to name new concepts or trying to find good examples of ways of doing things differently. Mm-hmm. But yeah, but Laura, on that, do you think that, like, are you finding examples of kind of concepts that you think could be extracted from this kind of work? Yeah,
I think so. I think the naming part of the process, I think that's where there's a real opportunity to bring together these more kind of written and linguistic kind of traditions together with the, making processes, and then naming. The naming is not something that we necessarily do well. And so even, in terms of naming the final projects in a way that is itself a kind of conceptual intervention, or has a clear point of view, rather than a kind of general name for a project. And I'm like, that's naming is that's part of, again, I think this is where we make metaphors through the naming, right? And And so often, I always encourage students in designing futures, for example, to name their project in a way that communicates a clear point of view about what they're trying to achieve. So maybe it's about practicing that a little bit more. And I know that I think Nick Berton and Virginia Tassinari have done some really wonderful workshops in kind of inventing new language. I remember one from the Design Research Society conference in Brighton where I think I was there for the workshop, and the idea was just kind of cutting up existing words and then recombining them in new ways as a way to be creative about language and really thinking. And I think it's almost like there's a kind of a party game that people like to play that has a similar quality, right? It's like kind of either picking words that are not well known and trying to explain what they mean, or it's something like that. But I do think that we can become more creative and inventive with the naming part of the design process. And maybe that would be a way, because to be honest, as a social scientist, when I come upon either interesting language in secondary literature that I'm reading, or when I try to create concepts that name a specific experience, either that I've had with a technology system or that I've observed other people having, depending on what kind of project I'm doing, that is a creative process, I would say. That, it's sort of creating theory is a creative process. It's an analytical process as well, because you're trying to name a specific phenomenon. But if that language becomes useful to others, then you really are creating new ways of understanding the world. So I guess that's where I would.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's a really but also that implies that that's part of a designed approach to trying to make this useful to others or valuable to others in the world in a strategic kind of way. It just made me think while you were talking how it's strange that so few design projects have names like papers or books. Like, if you wrote a book that was called, I'm just thinking of the name of a project, but I don't know. So a project some of my students did that was called, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of something that's a good example of one that doesn't explain anything about what it does. But so we did a sonification project on, electricity, sonifying it. That was called electric acoustic because we thought that was a cool name, because it's like you can hear it. It's electric acoustic. It doesn't explain what it does, right? But if it was a book about that, or it was a paper, you would call it, an investigation of, or an application of data sonification in qualitative blah, 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 which is a boring name. But on the other hand, it explains what it does in a way that most design projects don't. And I mean, that's a more nuanced kind of way of doing that might be really useful. I don't know. It's like, I'm trying to think. I mean, it always sounds funny, but it's like we feel that design projects should have a name, or very often should have a name that is sort of like a brand name, right? Like so often people will give it a name that's kind of as if it's the title of either an art piece or a brand name, as if it's a real product. But you wouldn't do that with a paper. You're not going to write a paper about I don't know, metaphors people use for AI systems and call it, metaphoro on its own, right? You would at very least have some sort of colon, blah 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 blah. And I don't know. That maybe is a stupid observation, but I hadn't thought of it until you said it just now, Laura. But I don't know, how much time do we have left, John?
You guys are bang on time. You're clearly glancing up to the top right corner of your screens. There's so much in there, you guys. That's a very, very rich discussion for us, and I think there's a huge amount of resonance with the aims of the course and the spirit with which we proceed on MAUX, which is all about how do we rematerialize experience in ways that are concept building and not just design delivering. So there's a lot in there for me. I could chat the rest of the afternoon. I want to hand over to Al to moderate perhaps some of the chat comments.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. Making things together as a way of navigating the knowledge is just, yeah. Thank you. So we have some questions. First of all, from Danny. how can we help foster a culture of inquiry and analysis through our design? And he was sort of drawing our attention in his comments back to that conversation about the duplicity of seamlessness and transparency and privacy. So as designers, how can we kind of mitigate against that, or be more generative or more active perhaps in another direction?
I mean, one answer I have is to just ask the very common science and technology studies question, which is, for whom, after every single sentence in the design studio, because there's so many assumptions when that question is not asked. They're just, everything trends towards a kind of universal idea of the human with very little understanding of location and context and race, class, gender, right? So I think that is one kind of easy way to, introduce criticality into the design studio, is to just constantly be asking, for whom is this valuable, or for whom is this seamless, or, and then being aware that every concept might have multiple meanings, I think could be another one.
Interesting. I mean, one way makes me think of how the questions like, I kind of quite glibly said, oh, but it's all about people materializing their imaginaries together, and, it's all great, and now we all know each other. But actually, the question of who gets to materialize their imaginaries, or whose imaginaries have been sort of inculcated in, that's the wrong word, but wherever they come from, right? Well, what power dynamics have been inherent in the fact that we all believe this, or not we all, but many do. So it could be even questioning where some of the ideas came from could enable some more of that kind of inquiry, or slightly more critical approach. Like, why is this where did this frame come from? Where did this metaphor come from? Have you just adopted it from, you've seen that recently with discussions of like where carbon footprint, for example, came from as a metaphor. Right now, it wasn't itself invented by an ad agency, but it was heavily popularized by BP's ad agency. They found academic papers that had calculated and come up with the metaphor of an individual carbon footprint, and they seized on that and used that so strongly, promoted it so strongly as an idea. And I think that's interesting, because I'd never questioned where that came from. I'd assumed it must be primarily an academic thing. But so yeah, there might be stuff like that which could be useful, I guess. Question things.
Thank you. And Ella was asking in relation also to transparency, is it a sleight of hand? Is it purely deployed as a means for further extraction? Ella's wondering. So I just dropped her question into the chat. So
I think this,
sorry.
Many of the values that like transparency or safety that was brought up with the AV case, I see these as sort of Trojan horses, because they are used as a way to promote a certain technology with a very different agenda. Sometimes the sort of claim around safety is really not the thing that's being sold. It's actually something entirely different, but it's the thing that it's most difficult to argue with, right? Because if one says that AVs, for example, are safer, who's going to say, well, oh, no, I want the less safe option, right? But in introducing these kind of the frictions, or the kinds of, I think glitches or failures and things, thinking about those as productive ways to engage. And, it's hard to figure out exactly what that means, because if we say that we want friction as a good thing in the design process, we certainly don't want, planes falling out of the sky, but we want, a different consideration of the kind of ways in which lived experience comes together with the abstract or the representations. So I think there's a couple of different things going on there. There's values, so to speak, that are used to sell technologies. And then there are, actual mismatches between the representation and the territory, so to speak, or the abstract and the concrete.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, maybe there's also something about for whom it appears, for whom is that transparency appearing transparent? And what does that, is it kind of, once you get to the stage of things being where it can only be, can only be experts that can assess that, which I think, like if I had an old car, I could check whether the brakes were, I could check whether the brakes cylinders were intact. If I have to rely on, so I could probably make some assumptions about whether it was safe. I could do a relatively manual. I could say, I do believe this is safe, or as safe as it can be. But I can't do that with a Tesla, can I? I've got to rely on the fact that the company's decided that it's safe and that it's safer than everything else. And fine, there would be bodies that would test it, fine. But I mean, I think it becomes, it's sort of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. Whatever open source software we use, it doesn't mean that every single person reads all of the code to validate the fact that it's actually not, at least we rely that someone will. And I think that's maybe, differs depending on who's, that's a rambling answer, but.
They're the best kind, aren't they? Rambling answers?
The preferred. John, you threw a question into the chat, which I'm intrigued by. I'm not sure if it's a fair question to ask. What part do we play in the performance of the future? Or I wonder if that's a rhetorical question. Did you want to elucidate?
Well, I actually don't. I guess all questions are rhetorical, but what I'm trying to get at is how much the students, particularly in this term that's just about to end, how much they've done performative work, dropping willingly and often unbidden into role play, performing the work, embodying the work, wearing the work. We had a lovely moment a couple of weeks ago. Some students, I think they're in the attendees here, they've made a jacket out of bubble wrap. This is a 2-week project that responds when you hug someone. So, okay, you can describe that, sounds great. But actually, when that's enacted, when those metaphors are entailed in the meeting of two bodies hugging in the studio, something really, really different happens that it just has quite a powerful emergent properties that actually go well beyond the design. And so that it just provoked that thought of what the part that we're playing in the performance of the future. We do actually have some abilities to shape that and to say what we want it to be. And I guess my call to students at this level is to take that spirit from the LCC room that we're in into everything else that you're going to do next. So yeah, I'm definitely intrigued by that question. Where are our, particularly these performative entry points into how these wider futures are performed on a much bigger stage or through interactive systems or something? I
mean, if I can comment on that a bit. I mean, so my colleague Leneka Koya has this, who's an expert on social practice theory as applied to design, particularly around sustainability, energy related things. And one of her points is that kind of, if you think about people's actions as practices, they're embedded socially, there are kind of, there are meanings to them that are beyond just you doing a particular behavior. Actually, new practices can be about designing something that makes it more likely that people kind of do hug each other. But then that becomes something people do. Once you create that future practice by just doing it. And I know this is sort of obvious to most designers. It's like, well, yeah, obviously, if you make something that makes it so people hug each other, then they're going to hug each other. So, but then the future has changed. It's now a future where people hug each other more. And I think that aspect of kind of seeing sort of almost like it is possible to, just by designing something that gets people or makes it more likely or makes it more enjoyable to do a particular thing, you can change. I mean, think about the argument that the designers of Zoom have actually had more impact on, or maybe developers of Zoom and the UX designers of Zoom have had more impact on potentially on changing work practices than and hence perhaps reductions in carbon emissions, all of that, than decades of designers working on sustainable behavior and can we persuade people to unplug their phones and all that. Making something so video conferencing was easy and people didn't commute as much, and I don't know whether that will happen, but you hope so, could actually have a much bigger impact on the future by making that practice something normal. It's normal for us to be doing this. It's not a weird thing. And I don't know, maybe that's obvious, but I think there's something there that Anyway,
I was on a panel about a month ago in which, with a number of people from an AV company, and I said, well, maybe the biggest competitor to kind of AV is actually Zoom, because there's all these claims about, AV making your commute shorter and you can be more productive while you're commuting. But if you're not commuting, right? But also Zoom has become part of culture, right? So just there's been, I think, numbers of kind of jokes and things that you see on TV that are using Zoom sort of boxes as the interface to showcase some new TV show or even in a movie, right? So it's like, as these things become introduced into everyday experience, they become part of culture as well, not only part of productivity or work or the way we see ourselves, but they become, virally part of a shared experience. Well, then again, for whom, right? Because there are plenty of people who haven't been working remotely via Zoom and have either been in essential jobs, showing up in person and taking greater risks. And so, I think, again, that becomes a critical question.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I don't know.
I mean, it's just very just enriching stuff, I think there's a lot for us to think about as designers there, isn't there? Why do we do what we do? And that great question from Laura, who are we doing it for? Repeated at every moment. And I think it is very true that what we're doing in a university often has, different applications. Al and I are quite careful to say, look, we're not the clients. Your job is not to please us. That's a message that, we repeat quite often. I want to give folks a chance maybe to get up and walk around again before we talk to Dylan and Nick. So huge thanks for that, Laura and Dan. Thanks very much, and we'd love to follow up on some of these points here. I don't quite know how, but maybe we can organise another session or a brief or a project or something together next term. So huge thanks to both of you, and folks. Let's have a quick 3-minute break before we continue with Dylan and Nick.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone in the UX program there.